loud. Okay, so we are so fortunate and so delighted to have Laura Orlando with us tonight. I'm going to read from her biography that's online. It's very impressive. Laura brings her interests in soil health, water quality, and public health to her work as the executive director of the Resource Institute for Low Entropy Systems, and she's an adjunct professor of environmental health at the Boston University School of Public Health. She has over 30 years of international experience working on the design, construction, and management of sustainable systems in the built environment, with a special focus on community-led water and sanitation projects. Her work includes research on toxic substances in municipal water and sewer systems and their exposure pathways, including technological, economic, and political influences, with the overarching goal of pollution prevention. She is a co-founder and trustee at the Ecological Health Network, senior science advisor at Just Zero, founding trustee and editorial board member at Barn Raising Media, and editorial board member at Rural America in These Times. So I am very delighted to have her with us, and I am going to turn it over to Laura. She will share her screen and away you go. Laura, go ahead. And you're muted, so please unmute yourself.
Here we go. Well, first I want to thank Mothers Out Front and you, Wendy, for inviting me to talk about forever chemicals tonight. And I loaded up the slides because I know they're going to be made available to everyone, and we'll figure that out one way or another. And so there's lots of information in here. This is an optimistic conversation about a terrible story. And but let me get started. Can you all see the first slide?
Yes, that looks great.
Great. As Wendy said, I'm the senior science advisor at a new organization that's focused on zero waste solutions nationwide, and it's called Just Zero. I'm super excited about that. And I've been at Boston University School of Public Health as an adjunct for 22 years. And I've been with Riles, which is a small foundation that was founded in 1990. And I helped co-found that. So I've been with Riles for 32 years. PFAS really came onto my radar screen about 7 years ago, I would say 7 or 8 years ago, when we began to see, well, maybe a little longer, 10 years ago, when we began to see reports quite a bit in the peer-reviewed literature about PFAS in sewage sludge and in treated wastewater and in the influent into sewage treatment plants. And I follow the chemicals that go into and out of sewage treatment plants very closely, and I have for 3 decades. Let's see. So I want to start with some definitions. PFAS is short for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're also called forever chemicals because they don't break down. They're made up of carbon and fluorine bonds that are just, they're human made, and they're very, very difficult to separate. And when I first started, I was looking at some old slides, and when I first started talking about PFAS to my class, for instance, at BU, I said there's at least 12,000 of them. And now the official number is at least 12,000, and that's an EPA number. Why are there more? Well, we're discovering that industry has made more, and industry is continuing to make more PFAS. The research is focused on fewer than 100 of these, and primarily on PFOA, which is also called C8. It's what's on your, I hope not your, but on Teflon or nonstick pans. It's also Teflon, and then PFAS. They're the most studied, and therefore they're currently the most regulated. They bioaccumulate, they're toxic, they're mobile, and they're persistent. They're found in soil, air, water. There's an increasing understanding that the entire class of PFAS chemicals are harmful to human health. So that's really important when we start thinking about regulation. If we try to regulate each one of those 12,000, we will not regulate PFAS. It's not to say we shouldn't regulate any of them, but the goal is to regulate them as an entire class of chemicals. So what is a part per trillion? Because you're going to hear me talk about parts per trillion in this talk. It's equivalent to a single drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. It's 1,000 parts per trillion is 1 part per billion. So lead, where most of us are familiar with lead and rules around lead in drinking water. Lead is the actionable level where a municipality has to deal with the lead in their drinking water, according to the Safe Drinking Water Act, is 15 parts per billion. That would be the equivalent of 15,000 parts per trillion, okay? So when we're talking later in the conversation, we're talking about 1 part per trillion or 7 parts per trillion or 70 parts per trillion. We're talking about very, very small concentrations. And currently the science, we can detect PFAS compounds down to about 2 parts per trillion. Where do we find forever chemicals? Fracking sites, mining sites, airports that use firefighting foam that has PFAS in it, especially military bases and most airports. We're not just finding it, stored at the airport. At the airports have practice fires, so they use these firefighting foams in practice to stay on top of their firefighting skills. So in those foams then leach into the environment, into waterways, into the ground, into surrounding communities. We find them in fish, contaminated wells, municipal water, cosmetics, farms where sewage sludge was applied and disposed of, gardens that use sludge-derived products like sludge-derived compost, water-resistant clothes. Patagonia says that by 2024, they're going to stop using PFAS in their clothing. There are community actions and public actions to get companies like REI to do the same thing with less success. But there are people out there trying to make change at every one of these, PFAS points, if you will. Dental floss, like Oral-B Glide, has PFAS in it. Not all. Desert Essence and Tom's, for instance, do not. The Environmental Health Network did a nice study on dental floss and PFAS that's available online. Factories where PFAS are used, we can't forget about the laborers and the workers that work in factories that make this stuff or use this stuff. They're particularly affected. In that which comes out of wastewater treatment plants, the treated wastewater and the sewage sludge and landfills are a primary source. Here's a nice little drawing of PFAS sources and cycles. I recently saw data that said 50 tons of PFAS are distributed in our atmosphere in the United States each year. You know, I'm talking about tons and pounds when we know human health is affected at levels in the parts per trillion. So it takes my breath away. How does it affect, how do PFAS, this family of chemicals, affect people? They're linked to serious health problems like weakened immune system, endocrine disruption, fertility problems, autoimmune diseases like ulcerative colitis, increased cholesterols, decreased response to vaccines. A really elegant study was done about that. Decreased birth weight in children, and on. It depends on the analyte. It depends on the PFAS, the chemical itself, long chain, short chain, and of course on you know, the concentration that's in somebody's body. So, but we know these are the effects, and we know that these are some of the effects at very, very, very low concentrations. So nearly all the blood of Americans can have PFAS. Now, don't let that, I mean, it's terrifying, but we know increased exposures increases blood serum levels considerably, right? So let's not increase exposures. Big thrust of some of the things I'm going to talk about later on. And let's not, don't let industry and others who wish to continue to use PFAS and distribute PFAS in our environment, don't be fooled into thinking, well, it's in our blood anyway, so there's nothing we can do about it, right? That is not true, and it's not a place that the public should go. Most studies have focused on PFAS in human blood, but now it's recently being found in human tissue. We're not sure what that means. Besides, it's not good. The clearance of PFAS from the body is slow, so they do accumulate, but they can clear over years depending the kind of PFAS. Not a lot is known about that either. And like with so many toxic chemicals, children are the most exposed population group. So here's a map from the Environmental Working Group, who has a PFAS project. Great website. I have the link to it at the end of the slideshow. But this is their most recent map of PFAS contamination in the US. There are some estimates that say 200 million people are exposed to PFAS in their drinking water, both well water and municipal water. Some states are more affected by others. It depends where you get your water. For instance, the Quabbin, if you have Boston water, or Cambridge sometimes switches to Quabbin water. Brookline uses Quabbin water from the MWRA. PFAS is not a factor in our drinking water. But you can see that the scope of the problem is pretty tremendous. PFAS in rivers, remember, millions of Americans get their water from surface water and from rivers in particular. The Waterkeeper Alliance just came out with a report showing that 83% of waterways tested had levels that exceeded federal and state limits. Two of the most studied and dangerous PFAS and PFOA were in 70% of the testing sites. One of the places that these rivers, one of the sources of PFAS, including PFAS and PFOA, are wastewater treatment plants. They are a pollution sink all over the world. And it's important to understand what they can and can't do in terms of treatment. What they cannot do is treat PFAS. So we have to go up the pipe and not expect in any way, shape, or forms that our wastewater treatment plants are going to eliminate PFAS. The technology doesn't exist. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. What about Massachusetts? I hope this isn't old news. Mass.gov has some really good information about PFAS. So I direct you there for perhaps more updated information. But there are 126 public drinking water systems in 86 communities with serious levels of PFAS contamination. Cambridge Water Department this summer detected the six PFAS, at least that they were looking for in the water. They switched to MWRA water. I believe they've switched back now to their to the local water sources that they use, mostly north and west of Cambridge. And right now they're measuring 17.1 parts per trillion of the combined 6 PFAS. So a lot, the states that do regulate PFAS, and by regulation, I mean within their water regulations, the state such as Massachusetts establishes a limit for some number of PFAS chemicals combined to equal, in the state of Massachusetts, it's 6 PFAS to equal 20 parts per trillion. If a municipality like Cambridge goes over 20 parts per trillion, they have to act on it. That's called the maximum contamination level. And Cambridge has to act on that and try to bring that number down. It's the same for lead. It's the same for other hazardous compounds in our drinking water. There is no federal, currently there is no federal MCL, maximum contaminant level, for any PFAS in drinking water. The Biden administration says that they're going to implement some kind of federal rule in 2023. The Massachusetts government recently funded a USGS study that found PFAS in 27, all of the rivers that they sampled that were down, they found PFAS downstream from wastewater treatment plants. So major sources of PFAS contamination are wastewater treatment plants, landfills, military bases because of the firefighting, airports because of the firefighting, and non-point sources such as sewage sludge when it's applied to land as a fertilizer, when PFAS gets into the air and falls down in the rain or wafts over to wherever it wafts over to. And now we're learning pesticides are a major source of PFAS. A little bit about landfills. The largest landfill in New Hampshire is called Turnkey. It's located in Rochester, New Hampshire. It's on a 1,200 acre site. Waste Management, Inc. Manages it or owns it. And these give you some numbers. There's a lot more, but this is the ones I grabbed from data that I had available to me a couple years ago. And it shows you parts per trillions, not in the 20s and not in the 10s and not in the 7s, but 100 or 1,000 times that. Where does that leachate go? So when it rains and the rain travels through a landfill and the landfill's lined, the landfill operators collect what does not leak out. All landfills that are lined leak, but they collect what does not leak out, the leachate, store it, and then or directly send it to a wastewater treatment plant. Or in the case of Turnkey, multiple wastewater treatment plants. And in 2017, to give you just a sense of the volume, Turnkey sent over 36 million gallons of PFAS laden. We're talking high concentrations of PFAS. Many different members of the PFAS family were in the leachate. They sent it to wastewater treatment plants, one in Rochester. They were sending it to Lowell, which is now getting sent up to Madison, Maine. And a study in 2017 showed that in the United States, in landfill leachate, the estimate was over 1,000 pounds of PFAS. So landfills are a major source. Just a little primer, what comes out of wastewater treatment plants: sewage sludge and treated wastewater or effluent, both have very high concentrations of PFAS in them. So here's just some numbers for sludge, almost 1 million parts per trillion of PFAS have been found in processed sewage sludge. I'm not saying that's what sewage sludge always looks like, but it always has high concentrations of PFAS. What this is telling you is that on land that has had sludge applied to it in this particular study, PFAS was found, and it was found migrating in the soil profile up to 17 meters below ground. So when we ask, well, how does PFAS get into the groundwater, for instance? Here's one example. This is interesting. There are many studies. This is just one from Australia, but the upshot of this is that in wastewater treatment plants, more PFOA and PFOS, for instance, more is coming out than is going in. On a mass balance level, more comes out than goes in. Why? Because of the precursors, the fluorotelomeres and other chemicals that make up, for instance, PFOA, are in the wastewater treatment plant. They're used in industry by the millions of pounds. And so that wastewater treatment plant becomes a chemistry set. And it's something we need to pay attention to. When we start talking about regulations, we have to think about precursors to some of these things we want to regulate. What's the regulatory landscape looking like? Well, it's changing. In 2016, EPA said, look, we're going to put out a health advisory. It's not a rule that says anybody has to do anything, but it's an advisory to the public that if you have a lifetime, if you ingestion, consumption, exposure to more than 70 parts per trillion of PFOS and PFOA, there can be health effects. So there was no MCL established. There's no federal rule around drinking water. 2 years later, the ATSDR, which does a lot of work on chemicals, said, look, we think that the levels in terms of minimum risk levels for these two forever chemicals are actually like a factor of 10 lower. The White House suppressed that study, calling it a public relations nightmare. 2 years later, Mass set an advisory, a health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. And then 2 years later came up with actual regulations in our drinking water. And again, that goes back to that maximum contaminant level. If you go over 20 parts per trillion for the combined 6 PFAS, then you got to do something about it, including notify the public, which is a very important point here. 2 years later, just this year in June, EPA released health advisories much lower. Look at the difference. It was 70, now it's 0.004, right? It was 70, now it's 0.02. So what they're saying is that there are negative health effects at zero, essentially zero concentration, or below our ability to detect, okay? And then just 2 months ago, EPA proposed designating PFOA and PFOS as hazardous substances, meaning EPA would have more leverage and more leeway to go after the industries that are responsible for PFOA and PFOS and make them pay for cleanup. It would also help track these chemicals. And there have been legislation banning PFAS chemicals in food packaging, which is really, really important. And so what are the primarily regulatory avenues we have? Drinking water limits and food packaging bills are really two places to pay a lot of attention. There are other ways. In the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress said the Department of Defense couldn't purchase PFAS firefighting foams, which is, it has its serious effect. And then EPA has other regulatory, let's call them opportunities. One is the Safe Drinking Water Act. So that would be that federal regulation they promised next year for maximum contaminant levels. But then also that Clean Water Act discharge permit, the NIPD, that has to do with wastewater treatment plants. And that will be very, very interesting to see. Those permits say what a wastewater treatment plant can and cannot discharge. And they're very, very simple, I guess is the best way to put it. They're focused on 5 or 6, maybe a few more measurable things like pH, putrescible matter, which is measured by BOD. They don't have anything to do with chemicals, and so with toxic chemicals. So it'll be really interesting to see if PFAS gets included in that somehow in those permits. And then, our laws that control chemicals, our laws that deal with the disposal, RCRA, it deals with the disposal of solid waste, the Clean Air Act, right? And then CERCLA, which is the hazardous substance law that I just mentioned. Litigation, there's lots of it. Moore Healey sued 13 manufacturers in May because their firefighting foam caused millions of dollars of damage in mass communities. 2 months ago, 1,700 property owners in Michigan, in Western Michigan, got $54 million from Wolverine Worldwide and 3M. 3M and DuPont are the manufacturers, the original manufacturers of PFAS. There'll be many, many more lawsuits. So what about treatment? This is a whole lot of information you can read offline, but the upshot is there's 2 categories: separation and destruction. Membrane filtration is separation. Chemical treatment is destruction, for example. Treatment trains, doing more than one treatment in a row, is the most effective currently that we have, say, especially, for instance, in drinking water plants. The literature does show degradation and removal, but these studies are mostly at a bench level, like at a laboratory-based level. There are very few that have been scaled up that show the kind of numbers that you see here. And then you got to add to it, like membranes get fouled, they need to be changed. There's other organic pollutants. We don't know how that'll affect these treatment systems. It's high energy consumption, right? Etc. And I don't want you to be fooled by the word treatment and sewage treatment. I can't emphasize enough that PFAS are not treated or otherwise mitigated in wastewater treatment plants as, purposefully as part of the processes happening in those facilities. And then there was some really good news 2 months ago of a new destruction technique mixing PFAS with DMSO, and boom, it broke the chain. And it was so simple, nobody looked at it. So the question is, can this be scaled up? Does this have real world applications? And I know it's not very scientific, but fingers crossed, it does. Real people are affected. Adam Nordell and Johanna Davis at Songbird Farm in Maine, they can't farm there anymore. They bought an organic farm, they tended it, they cared for it, they had a CSA, lots and lots of happy customers. And then they found out that sludge had been dumped on their farm years ago. And so they, on their own volition, tested themselves and their food and found elevated levels of PFAS. Another farm, Misty Brook in Albion, that's Keisha and Brendan Holmes. They discovered PFAS contamination. And again, this is on their own volition. They tested their cow's milk. They have an organic raw milk dairy. And they learned that the PFAS that poisoned their cows came from hay that was brought into the farm. They had to discard 6,000 pounds of beef, get a new herd. They're financially devastated, but not out of business. And they continue to do testing on themselves, their livestock, their meat, and their milk. And they're sharing that testing data on their website, which I have here. So what do we do? Let's start with the precautionary principle, right? There's 12,000 plus PFAS. There's only testing protocols for about 36 of them. We don't know a lot about them. So what is the precautionary principle? It states that when an activity raises threats to harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. This is where we can regulate PFAS as a family of chemicals, right? Yeah, we're not going to know about every single one, but we know enough. What do we do? Like with climate change, we can't shut down, right? When we learn about PFAS. In her book, Raising Elijah, the activist and author Sandra Steingraber talks about well-informed futility syndrome, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she says the more knowledgeable we are about a problem, the more paralyzed we are. Futility forestalls action, but action is exactly what is needed. Just down the street from well-informed futility resides denial. In the face of knowledge too upsetting to bear, there's nothing to do but look away, right? Wrong. Her antidote to futility and denial: rise up in the face of the terrible knowledge and do something. In other words, act like, in her words, a member of the French resistance. So what do? Act. Stop making PFAS. Stop using PFAS in clothing, footwear, and other consumer goods. Patagonia's doing it. Let's get other people to do it. Other companies. Stop land applying sewage sludge. That can happen tomorrow at a federal level if those NPDES, those NIPDES permits are changed. Change the permits to say that sewage sludge cannot be land applied, meaning it cannot be used as a fertilizer on farms, parks, forests, and other land in the United States. Stop burning sludge. Stop burying trash. Let's close the landfills. Let's move towards zero waste. Stop adding food scraps to anaerobic digesters at sewage treatment plants. And I'm looking at you, Cambridge. This is what Cambridge does with your food scraps. It goes to the sewer in North Andover, Massachusetts. Keep compost clean. Don't add sludge to it. Ban PFAS in food packaging. Regulate PFAS as an entire class of chemicals. Pass federal regs for PFAS in drinking water at what are called maximum contaminant level goals. This is what we want. The goal is 0. The goal for lead is 0. It must be the same for the entire class of PFAS. Join us at Just Zero and let your kids see you join the French resistance or mothers out front. So here's more information. And then you can follow Just Zero here. And remember, mothers, even when they're wrong, they're right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. I am going to now try and find Francis and spotlight.
I'm here, ladies. Thank you very much.
I'm going to spotlight you, add spotlight. There we go.
What a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And thank everybody for coming tonight, because we don't want to be paralyzed. We all want to be active.
Right.
We've got lots of questions here, so I'm going to start on them.
Sure.
First, you answered the question about limits, so I'll go on to the next one. Has artificial turf been included in the data collection?
I just lost you. Yes. Artificial turf contains PFAS. It's one of the reasons, right? Mayor Wu has banned it for its use, but I don't know what you mean in the data collection, but there are lots of people looking at PFAS, among other toxic chemicals that are in artificial turf.
Okay. Are these chemicals so difficult to ban because of industry power, or the fact that there's so many in so many products? Why is this so difficult?
No,
to
that's a great question. These chemicals were created in the 40s or 50s, I forget. And both 3M and DuPont have known about their toxicity, this dangerous level of toxicity since then. In the early 2000s, Robert Beloit, who is featured in the movie Dark Waters, there's a link to a terrific New York Times Magazine article about him. He's a real hero on the PFAS world. He's a lawyer. He delivered over 900-page document to these companies and to the public showing this level of toxicity and harm. And so, EPA knew about it and so on. So some of it is industry deceit, like we've had from tobacco is a great example. Some of it is federal government inaction. When they knew about the problem, they didn't act. And some of it is, it's you add one more carbon chain, or you take away one fluorine, and now you have a new chemical. And we have a regulatory framework that looks at each of the chemicals to decide if they're harmful or not. And it moves very, very slowly, as I think we all know. And so it either, when it doesn't want to keep up, it doesn't, and when it can't keep up, it can't, so but all of those things are fixable.
Mhm. Let's move on. Is there any way to reduce the high cost of PFAS testing? Make it less expensive so the ordinary people have more access?
Yeah, you might want to look. I don't know if Brendan and Keisha Holmes talk about, they're doing their own testing, but I don't know what those numbers are. I do know on the Cape, Silent Spring, I believe, is running a program. Certain communities can be tested for free. I mean, we'll probably see more of that, where there's PFAS contamination in a community, that money will come into the public, probably federal money, to get tested, but I don't really know what those testing numbers are, so I'm not a good person to ask. But I think as more people are affected and are scared about PFAS, as they should be, and worried about it for themselves and their children, that I'm hoping there'll be more testing opportunities at more affordable prices.
Okay, sludge is often talked about in your slides. Are there better ways for it to be treated?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is I talk about it because it's a major source of PFAS. And so we need to look at it. But no, you can't treat the sewage sludge to take the PFAS out. But what you can do is keep the sewage sludge out of our compost. You can keep it out of you don't burn it, so you're not releasing the PFAS that's in the sludge into the air, right? And you don't call it a fertilizer and put it on land where it's now, Maine just banned the land application of sludge, because everywhere they look, wherever it's been, there's high concentrations of PFAS. And so we need to move towards making less of it, and always go up the pipe and try to reduce the chemicals that are going into our sewers. And so those are some of the quick and easy things.
How long have PFAS been endangering us?
Since they were in the environment, and since they were put on Teflon pans, and we sprayed our kids' Ugg boots with the water repellent that was probably PFAS. So since the 1950s.
My Life Straw water filter pitcher claims to filter these things. Is that possible?
I'm unfamiliar with that water filter. I don't think it's possible, but I could be wrong. Water treatment facilities are having a very difficult time filtering it. Some granulated activated carbon, at least on the water treatment plant, definitely filters some of the PFAS and can do a good job of it. Look at Cambridge. At a household level, I'm unfamiliar with filters, but it doesn't mean they're not out there.
Another related sludge question. You've talked about no, don't let it spread into other sources. How do we dispose of it though? What do we do with all this
Well,
sludge?
we're gonna have to, it's not, we can't close the loop on it, so we need to keep it out of life cycles and put it into landfills. And I would like to see it go into municipally owned landfills,
Hmm.
where we can control the matrix and we can control the prices. And we can reduce its volume by digesting it, for instance. Boston digests, I mean, anaerobic digestion does reduce the volume, and that is a good thing.
So that's a good place for anaerobic digestion. And I
That
assume
is.
that these landfills are sealed somehow, so you're not having leaching going on.
Well, they're not sealed at all. They are belching methane and leaking that poison leachate. But there are things that one can do to reduce the belching and reduce the leaking, but not eliminate it. And then, of course, not adding to them and not building new ones is a goal.
Okay, we've got more questions. Do we have data for the wheelabrator waste to energy plant in Saugus?
We do. We have, go to Just Zero or give us a call or email me and get you some, let us know what kind of data you want, and we may have it.
Okay. What is the level in rainwater? Is it safe to use on vegetable gardens?
It
Scary
is
question.
in rainwater, and I think it depends a lot. Like, for instance, I saw a study of a plant somewhere in Vermont, a factory that was manufacturing something that used a lot of PFAS. In downwind, there was considerable PFAS coming out of the plant, atmospheric disposition of the PFAS. And so would the rain be more affected there than it would be somewhere else? I don't know. I use rainwater on my vegetable garden. And at some point, I mean, I know rainwater can contain PFAS, but is it across the board at levels that we can't use it? No, certainly no more, much less than drinking water concerns.
Mm. Oh boy. How are these chemicals allowed in so many food-related products anyway?
That's a great question. And why haven't we why right now are we talking about packaging that has PFAS on it? That should just be stopped. And we know the harm, we know it. This is not tricky science. It's not, you don't have to look through, find some obscure journal. This is coming out of everything from the CDC, the federal government, EPA, to thousands of peer-reviewed papers. Why is it still industry pressure? The same reason we had cigarettes for too long, etc.
Okay, how regularly do you think PFAS should be tested on compost to be safe, to have safe levels?
That's a really good question. I think knowing where your compost is from is the place to start, not testing. So if you know where your compost is from, or you know who's doing the composting. So if you contract with Black Earth, Black Earth does not use sewage sludge, for instance, or biosolids, categorically do not use it in their compost. So that's the real way to define, the first thing to do is say, does my compost that I'm purchasing have any biosolids in it? In one way to know that, you can go to the company website, you can search for the word biosolids. If it doesn't say, but the best thing is if on the bag, it doesn't say what it is, if it describes an ingredient as compost, for instance, maybe not so good. And So know what it is, what is it called? It's just slipping my mind. I buy their compost, the Maine, it's the purple bags, lobster compost.
Yeah.
Come on, somebody.
Coast of Maine.
Coast of Maine, right. They absolutely don't use sludge. And so can you get, there's a link to a Sierra Club Ecology Center study that was just done this year in my references that they look at home fertilizers, and they talk a lot about this issue and what to know and what not to know and what they found and what they didn't find. So if you're concerned beyond that, say it's a commercial compost user that does not use sludge, but they compost some food packaging and so on and so forth, then you could test, or you could ask them what their tests show. And then we're back to get the PFAS out of the food packaging.
People might want to know that the action group, the Healthy Soils Action Group, has been keeping track of what different compost companies do, where they get their materials, because so many communities are having to search into this. So that's a working document that we can send to people that are trying to find out about compost companies. Okay, next one. How effective is PFAS testing? And is there some way that can be certified, the results?
I think the testing is pretty good but you have to target it. You have to test for PFOA. You have to test, you're testing for a particular analyte. And I think my understanding is it's quite good. Maybe go to Silent Spring and explore a little bit about what they're doing on their PFAS project, because it involves blood testing. Or just send me an email and I'll find out more information.
Silent Spring is what?
I'm sorry. The Silent Spring Institute. It's based in Newton. Terrific organization, just great. And they look at issues like breast cancer and the environmental triggers and causes to breast cancer. And they look at lots of other health-related problems from toxic chemicals and so on, including PFAS.
Okay, I'm aware of the time. We've got 6 minutes and a lot more questions, so let's get going here.
Well, what I was going to ask Laura is if she's willing to stay a little bit longer than 7 o'clock to answer some questions,
Sure.
if she'd be willing to do that. So anyone who has to leave at 7, please do. Can you stay, Frances?
Yes.
Yeah. So anyone who has to leave at 7, we're grateful that you were able to come on. And if you want to stay and hear Laura take some more questions, then please do.
Well, it is a treat to have someone so knowledgeable to ask our questions of. So here's the next one. Is PFAS harmful when it's in compost, and is it used in biofuel?
Is it used in biofuel? I suppose it depends on what you're burning, right? It's not used, but if you're burning something with PFAS in it, it doesn't just disappear. It'll end up it'll end up in the exhaust, if you will. But it really depends on the feeder stock. So I can't really answer that. So all biofuel? Absolutely not, for sure.
We have to know more about it.
Yeah, I mean, like if you put food scraps in an anaerobic digester to capture the methane to use as fuel, those food scraps, as long as they're not mixed with sludge, are going to be that fuel is going to be great.
Okay.
And what was the other part of that?
The compost. Is it harmful when it's in compost?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, what we're learning, just say there is no safe level of, for instance, of PFOA and PFOS. I think we'll find that with other PFAS as well. But right now, where we're at, just like with lead, we can't get rid of it out of our water systems. And so there are some level of lead allowed, and then massive amount of research around how does that affect our children. And we know there are thresholds where the effects are immediate and terrible, neurotoxicity effects. And so it's going to be the same with PFAS. So you do not want to use a compost that has PFAS in it. Should you never use compost? No. It's just like breast milk has PFAS in it. Do you still breastfeed your child? Yes, you do, if you can.
Getting loud and clear the message to read the label as best you can. Okay,
That's
next one is kind of an important question too. How can you tell if the food packaging where you put your food comes in that has PFAS in it?
That's a really good question. And I think some of the people that work on the food packaging issue would be better than me to ask that, of which there are some very, very knowledgeable people. But anything that is grease resistant, any of that packaging that's grease resistant, I think I across the board will say that has PFAS in it.
Like
Now,
a pizza box.
I have looked up parchment papers and so on, for baking, and because this is an issue for so many people, it does come up right online. Like, no, we do not use PFAS in our parchment paper, for instance. So you can do some exploring on your own. It's too bad it's up to the individual to do that. But anything that's stain or grease resistant, you have to give it a double look, I think.
This one relates to a previous question. Maybe you don't know the answer. It's back to those water filters for home. If someone wants to learn more about water filters and which ones might be good for PFAS, how would they do that?
Well, again, my understanding is there aren't home water filters that eliminate PFAS. And so I'm not sure where you would go to, since they're not out there. I'm not sure I'm not sure where one would go.
You might have to do your own work going through.
Oh, you would, absolutely. And I would ask a lot of questions if somebody said they had a Brita type filter or something that could remove PFAS. Now, if you had a whole home system that used something like reverse osmosis and you kept up with, its maintenance, you can absolutely reduce the level of PFAS. Now, you just need to know what you're going after. What is of concern? What is the city or your groundwater testing showing is the level of concern? And then you can begin to go at it. But I'll give you an example, like those communities that were affected by Wolverine worldwide over in the Grand Rapids area in Michigan, the state is having to twist and turn and spend millions and millions of dollars to get communities that were on well water onto municipal systems and do it fast, because these people cannot drink their water. Now, if there was a filter they could give these folks, right? Either a whole home filter or a countertop, they absolutely would do that. And so, and that's happening in many, 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 many places around the country where folks who are on wells are being either having to drink bottled water or being put on municipal systems.
Okay, thank you. Next one. This is about the correlations of PFAS to cancer. And this person is particularly thinking about pancreatic cancer and glioblastoma, which are on the increase. Do you have any specifics on that?
I haven't seen any link to PFAS and glioblastomas or glial cancers. Doesn't mean they're not there by any stretch, right? It's very, finding a smoking gun for a cancer, as we all know, is very, very difficult. The ones that have been identified are not the glioblastomas or the pancreatic. It doesn't mean they're not there. And, and again, there are 12,000 different PFAS chemicals, and we're only looking at a handful of them. So the way I look at cancer in the environment is it's a layer. There are layers, and we have layers of exposures. We're all exposed to benzene. We're all exposed to PFAS. We as we unpeel those layers, if we can't unpeel them, we have to reduce our exposures. We may not be able to reduce the exposures to zero, but we can significantly reduce our exposures. And not only as individuals, but demand that our federal and state authorities help us on that.
Okay. We've spoken to buying composters, but there's people concerned about making sure that they read the bags, and I think we.
Read the bags, and if it doesn't make sense to you, like when you look at a Coast of Maine bag, they tell you just what it is. They say what it, it's this, it's that, and then you're doing good.
So if it's not there, you better watch out.
Yeah.
And it's like it helps to know your source. Are there testing kits available? Do you know anything about that? This person wants to test their compost.
Oh, I have no idea. I don't, thank you. I've never heard of a home testing kit for PFAS. It doesn't mean there isn't one. But I don't know. Again, maybe Ecology Center and Sierra Club, it did the report on the fertilizers, would be a good place to look to see if there's, where one gets like compost tested.
Now, here's a fun question. How did hay in Maine get PFAS in it?
Well, the question is, where did Keisha and Brendan buy their hay? And so I can tell you, Maine was a huge promoter of using sludge on land as a fertilizer. And there was a terrific article in the Maine Monitor on Sunday by a woman named Marina Schoeffler. And I linked it on the resources, and she opens the article up with a quote from the state of Maine saying, we have got the cleanest sludge in the country, or something silly like that. So they dumped this stuff all over the place, tens of thousands, probably millions of pounds. And so that hay was grown on one of those fields.
Mm-hmm. See, we have here, why are we still talking about pesticides? Is industry pressure ever going to stop?
Good question. Yeah, that science is coming in. I think it's sort of trickling in right now, but it's going to be a fire hose really soon about pesticides in PFAS and pesticides. It's probably a surfactant. I'm pretty sure it is, and so it helps. My guess is, and I read a little bit about this, it helps, when you spray your poison, it helps coat the leaf, it helps it stay on the plant, the broadleaves that you're trying to kill or whatever.
Okay, we got here, what's the link? You still have some energy left for us?
I do.
Okay, what's the link between biosolids and compost and water?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, this is one I talked a lot about, biosolids. Besides the fact that millions of tons are spread on farmland and parks every year, that the PFAS that's in the sewage sludge, also known as biosolids, they leach. It leaches. As I cited one particular study in my slides, where it shows that the PFAS leach, 17 meters into the ground. So that's the water connection, right? That's the leaching of the PFAS from the biosolids into the water. And what was the other one? Compost. That for instance, there's a place, it sounds lovely. It's called Hawk Ridge in Maine, in Unity, Maine, right where that one of those farms was put out of business, Songbird Farm, because of the PFAS. Hawk Ridge takes tens of thousands of pounds of sewage sludge every year from places like the Lowell wastewater treatment plant and many others. That's trucked up there, and they add wood chips to it, and they call it compost, and they sell it to landscapers and other people. And that's happening all over the country. And so those of us who love compost, and our grandmothers and mothers probably never had to explain what compost was and wasn't. And here we are having to say, no, not clean compost, not poisoned compost. And sludge is a really bad actor in this whole poisoning of compost. And it's a greenwashing technique. What's wrong? Compost is great. We all love it. And so just know what's in it. Know what's in your compost. And if it's biosolids, don't use it.
Do you think the Cambridge curbside compost program, mixing sludge in, is responsible for elevated PFAS in the water?
Well, no, I actually, I don't wish to make that link actually, but I see where you're going with it. So Cambridge takes its food scraps, good people of Cambridge put them in those little green bins, say compost on them. and then save that stuff. A solid waste company picks it up, brings it to a facility in Charlestown where it's ground up into a slurry and then trucked to the Greater Lawrence Sanitary District, the second largest wastewater treatment plant in the country that serves Lawrence and Andover. It's in North Andover, and they dump that food scraps into the anaerobic digesters at the sewage treatment plant where it's mixed. It effectively becomes sludge. And so the food scraps become sludge, and then whether that sludge is brought up to Hawk Ridge and turned into compost, Casella has the contract, I think, for it, whether they dump it on a farm in New Hampshire, that's up to Casella. But those food scraps, which could be perfectly useful and wonderful compost, become poisons.
Pretty shocking. Would you consider the waxy lining inside milk cartons and other similar products the same as grease-resistant packaging and therefore may be full of PFAS?
My understanding is that that is not PFAS. I should know what it is, but I don't. The food packaging is not my bailiwick. But there are lots of people that know a lot about it. So there are people to reach out to for that.
Since it was mentioned a couple of times, people asking about home filtration, Kim from Malden has been nice enough to give something in the chat of someplace you can get more information. Let's see, we got a closing comment of outrage. Can anyone believe it's possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for all life? Can anyone believe people are putting this stuff on our soils? And yes, the answer is yes, it continues, and it's up to us to work on stopping it.
That's right.
All right.
It's so great to talk to you all and be part of Mothers Out Front and the great work that you and your admirers and colleagues and friends are doing. We have to keep at it.
Now, Wendy, would you like some final words? But
Yeah,
you
I'm
did a
just
great job.
trying to remove the spotlight here, which I can't seem to be able to do.
Should have worn something flashier.
Oh, well, I just want to thank Laura so much for being here and for staying long to answer our questions. We will be sending out a follow-up email that will contain the slides. We will hopefully in a couple of weeks or a week have the recording up on the Mothers Out Front YouTube channel so that people can access it there, and we'll let people know about that. And in our follow-up, we will also include all the wonderful links and information that was put into the chat, because there was a lot of good things put into the chat. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you so much, Laura. This was wonderful and we learned so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.